April 15, 1945. The Third Reich stood on the precipice of oblivion, yet what transpired in the following weeks would defy conventional military logic. While Soviet forces stormed through Berlin's shattered streets, nearly 500,000 German soldiers made a calculated choice that would echo through history. They would surrender to the Americans rather than face the Red Army's wrath. The spring morning broke over Bavaria with deceptive tranquility. Oberst Heinrich Müller stood at his command post in the Bavarian Alps, watching columns of Wehrmacht soldiers streaming westward. These were not retreating formations in the traditional sense. They were men executing a deliberate exodus, choosing captivity under one conqueror rather than another. The colonel's hands trembled as he held the latest intelligence reports detailing Soviet advances from the east. His decision had been made weeks ago, but implementing it meant condemning everything he had sworn to protect. The genesis of this mass surrender traced back to events that had crystallized throughout the brutal winter of 1944 to 1945. German soldiers returning from the Eastern Front carried tales that stripped away any romantic notions of honorable defeat. They spoke in hushed tones of reprisals, of entire units vanishing into the Soviet interior, of treatment that made death seem preferable. These accounts, initially dismissed as defeatist propaganda, gained credibility as the Red Army's advance accelerated. Müller remembered the night of February 20, 1945, when his trusted adjutant, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, had returned from a reconnaissance mission near the collapsing Eastern Front. Weber, a decorated veteran who had survived Stalingrad, sat in the dimly lit bunker and spoke with the hollow voice of a man who had witnessed humanity's darkest capabilities. He described Soviet units executing German prisoners without trial, entire villages collaborating in revenge killings, and NKVD detachments establishing filtration camps where German soldiers simply disappeared. According to documentation later compiled by the United States Army Historical Division, which meticulously recorded testimonies during Operation Eclipse, the Allied occupation plan, German military intelligence had been tracking Soviet treatment of prisoners since 1943. The reports painted a grim picture that influenced tactical decisions at every command level. The American forces, by contrast, represented an entirely different prospect. General Dwight Eisenhower's command had established clear protocols for prisoner treatment, largely adhering to Geneva Convention standards. German officers who had been captured and later escaped brought back accounts of organized POW camps, adequate medical care, and most importantly, survival. The psychological calculus became devastatingly simple. Surrender west and live, surrender east and face an uncertain fate that likely ended in Siberian labor camps or unmarked graves. By early April 1945, entire German army groups began orchestrating what military historians would later term strategic capitulation. General der Infanterie Friedrich Schulz, commanding forces in Bavaria, initiated secret communications with American advance units through Swiss intermediaries. His message was straightforward. His forces would offer minimal resistance if guaranteed treatment as prisoners of war under international law. The Wehrmacht's command structure, though nominally still answering to Hitler's increasingly delusional directives from the Führerbunker, had effectively fragmented into regional commanders, making independent survival calculations. These men, many of whom were career officers educated in the Prussian military tradition, understood that the war was irretrievably lost. Their remaining duty, as they rationalized it, was to preserve their soldiers' lives. The catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad during the winter of 1942 to 1943 had established the template for what German soldiers could expect if captured by Soviet forces. Of the approximately 90,000 German soldiers who surrendered after Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus's capitulation in February 1943, fewer than 6,000 would ever return to Germany. This staggering mortality rate became common knowledge throughout the Wehrmacht, transmitted through the grapevine of survivors and intelligence reports that circulated despite official suppression. Lieutenant Klaus Hoffmann had been one of those rare survivors. Released in 1953 as part of the first wave of German POW repatriations, he had spent a decade in Soviet captivity, moving between camps in the Ural Mountains and Kazakhstan. His testimony, recorded by American intelligence officers in 1954, provided crucial insight into the psychological factors driving the mass westward surrender. Hoffman described a systematic regime designed to break prisoners both physically and psychologically. Starvation rations, brutal forced labor in coal mines and timber camps, summary executions for minor infractions, and the pervasive sense that survival was merely a matter of statistical chance rather than any humane policy. The Soviet approach to German prisoners emerged from a complex mixture of genuine security concerns, ideological hatred, and institutional revenge. Stalin's orders, transmitted through NKVD channels, treated German prisoners as both war criminals and labor resources to be exploited for Soviet reconstruction. The distinction between Wehrmacht soldiers and SS personnel, theoretically important under international law, collapsed in practice. Soviet filtration camps made little differentiation, assuming collective German guilt for the devastation inflicted during Operation Barbarossa and the subsequent occupation. Research documented by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has established that approximately 3 million Soviet POWs perished in German captivity through deliberate starvation, exposure, and execution. Facts well known to Soviet military and political leadership. This created a reciprocal cycle of brutality, where German soldiers captured on the Eastern Front could expect treatment calibrated to match, if not exceed, the atrocities committed against Soviet prisoners. By spring 1945, the Red Army's advance through Eastern Europe provided fresh evidence of Soviet intentions. In East Prussia, Pomerania, and Silesia, German military units witnessed the fate of civilians left behind in the Soviet wake. Cities like Königsberg and Danzig experienced systematic violence that reinforced every German soldier's worst fears about capture. Officers attempting to maintain discipline found their authority undermined by the simple truth that retreat westward offered the only plausible path to survival. General Major Otto Schreiber commanded the remnants of the 24th Panzer Division near Prague in early April 1945. His division, once a formidable mechanized force, had been reduced to fewer than 4,000 effective soldiers with minimal armor and artillery. Schreiber faced an impossible situation: Soviet forces advancing from the east, American forces pushing from the west, and partisan uprisings threatening his supply lines. His diary, preserved in the Bundesarchiv military archives, reveals the agonizing calculus of a professional soldier watching his world disintegrate. On April 8, 1945, Schreiber wrote, "The men no longer respond to traditional motivations. They do not fight for the Führer, nor for National Socialist ideology, nor even for Germany as an abstract concept. They fight only to maintain westward mobility, to avoid falling into Soviet hands. This is not desertion in the classical sense. It is collective survival instinct overriding military discipline." The psychological breaking point for many German units came with the Yalta Conference agreements, concluded in February 1945. Though the precise terms remained classified, rumors circulated that the Allied powers had effectively divided Europe into spheres of influence, with Germany itself subject to partition. For German soldiers, this meant that their home territories would fall under Soviet occupation, regardless of where they surrendered. However, personal survival still favored American or British captivity, transforming the final weeks of the war into a desperate race westward. While German soldiers fled the specter of Soviet vengeance, they ran toward an American military system that, despite its own complexities and contradictions, offered tangible hope for survival. The United States Army's approach to prisoner handling reflected both practical considerations and the influence of international law, though implementation varied considerably depending on circumstances, location, and the attitudes of individual commanders. General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group, sweeping through southern Germany in April 1945, found itself confronted with an unprecedented logistical challenge. Wehrmacht units were surrendering faster than American forces could process them. Bradley's headquarters established temporary holding areas in open fields near captured German towns, where tens of thousands of prisoners congregated under minimal guard. These improvised facilities, though hardly comfortable, represented a stark contrast to Soviet filtration camps. Corporal Thomas Henderson of the 4th Armored Division recorded his observations in letters home during late April 1945. His accounts, later donated to the Library of Congress Veterans History Project, provide a ground-level perspective on the surrender dynamics. Henderson described German soldiers approaching American lines with white flags, sometimes entire companies marching in formation to surrender en masse. Many Germans spoke enough English to articulate their primary concern: confirmation that they were surrendering to Americans rather than Soviets. The American military's adherence to Geneva Convention protocols, while imperfect, created a reputation that preceded advancing units. German prisoners received medical attention for wounds, were provided with rations comparable to American soldier supplies, and most importantly, were documented and processed through official channels. This bureaucratic accountability, mundane as it might seem, represented a form of protection against the summary justice that characterized the Eastern Front. Documentation from the International Committee of the Red Cross, which maintained observers with American forces throughout the European campaign, noted that United States prison camps generally permitted Red Cross inspections and correspondence privileges. These safeguards, established through international treaty obligations and American military regulations, provided German prisoners with rights that existed largely in theory on the Eastern Front. The contrast became particularly evident in the treatment of wounded prisoners. American field hospitals, stretched beyond capacity during the final offensive, nevertheless treated German wounded alongside American casualties. Dr. Howard Richardson, a surgeon with the 102nd Evacuation Hospital, later testified that medical staff made no distinction between nationalities when prioritizing treatment based on injury severity. German soldiers with serious wounds received the same surgical interventions, anesthesia, and post-operative care as American wounded, a practice virtually unthinkable in the chaos of the Eastern Front. However, the American system was not without severe problems. The sheer volume of surrendering Germans overwhelmed existing prisoner facilities. By May 1945, the United States Army held over 1 million German prisoners in European theater, with infrastructure designed for a fraction of that number. The most controversial manifestation of this crisis emerged in the Rheinwiesenlager, open-air detention camps established in the Rhine meadows where hundreds of thousands of prisoners lived in primitive conditions with inadequate shelter, sanitation, and initially, food supplies. James Back's controversial 1989 book Other Losses claimed that conditions in these camps resulted in significant prisoner mortality, though his specific figures and interpretations have been disputed by mainstream historians. What remains undisputed is that the camps represented humanitarian failures born of logistical collapse rather than systematic policy. German prisoners endured considerable hardship, but the fundamental difference from Soviet captivity remained. They survived in documentable numbers, were eventually released, and could return to their homes. Captain Robert Miller, a prisoner processing officer with the 7th Army, maintained detailed records of German soldier motivations for westward surrender. His reports, declassified in 1975, revealed that over 80% of surrendering soldiers explicitly cited fear of Soviet captivity as their primary concern. Many carried carefully preserved documents proving their Wehrmacht, rather than SS affiliation, believing this distinction would matter to their captors. The final weeks of April 1945 witnessed the disintegration of German military discipline on an unprecedented scale. Traditional command structures, maintained through 4 years of increasingly desperate warfare, finally collapsed under the combined weight of military defeat, ideological exhaustion, and the practical imperative of survival. What emerged was not chaos in the conventional sense, but rather a spontaneous reorganization around the singular objective of reaching American lines. General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in the West, faced an impossible situation. Hitler's orders from Berlin demanded fanatical resistance, promising miracle weapons and relief forces that existed only in the Führer's increasingly delusional imagination. Meanwhile, Kesselring's subordinate commanders were independently negotiating surrender terms with advancing Allied units. The Field Marshal, a skilled tactician who had prolonged the Italian campaign far beyond reasonable expectations, recognized that continuing resistance served no purpose except multiplying casualties. On April 23, 1945, Kesselring received intelligence that entire divisions under his nominal command were moving westward without orders, abandoning defensive positions to avoid Soviet encirclement. His diary entry from that date, preserved in German military archives, captures the moment when theoretical command authority diverged completely from practical reality. "I can issue orders, but whether they are obeyed depends entirely on whether they align with the soldier's survival instincts. I am no longer commanding an army. I am presiding over an organized retreat toward captivity." The breakdown of discipline manifested differently across military units, depending on leadership, remaining ideological commitment, and geographical position. Waffen-SS units, heavily indoctrinated and commanded by officers with no illusions about their fate if captured, fought with suicidal intensity to the end. Their resistance, however, increasingly served to clear paths for Wehrmacht units seeking to surrender. In several documented instances, Wehrmacht officers secretly communicated German defensive positions to American forces, effectively trading intelligence for preferential surrender terms. Oberst Johann Richter commanded a Wehrmacht regiment in Bavaria during the final days of April 1945. His unit, originally part of the 7th Army defending the Alpine Redoubt, had been reduced by casualties and desertion to fewer than 800 men. Richter faced daily defections as soldiers simply walked away from their positions, heading west on their own initiative. On April 28, 1945, he gathered his remaining officers and formally proposed surrendering the entire regiment to approaching American units. The proposal encountered unexpected resistance from younger officers, products of Hitler Youth indoctrination, who retained ideological commitment to the Nazi cause. These officers, many in their early 20s, argued for continued resistance despite the hopeless tactical situation. The generational divide within the Wehrmacht's officer corps, between career military professionals and Nazi true believers, erupted into open conflict. In Richter's case, the dispute was resolved when senior NCOs, hardened veterans who had survived campaigns from Poland to Normandy, sided with the colonel, effectively overruling the younger officers through the weight of experience and survival instinct. According to research compiled by the United States Army Center of Military History, this pattern repeated across German forces in the West throughout late April and early May 1945. Traditional military hierarchy inverted as junior enlisted personnel, whose primary concern was survival rather than honor or ideology, effectively dictated command decisions through the threat of mass desertion. The psychological state of German soldiers during this period defies simple categorization. They were not broken in the sense of having lost the capacity to fight. Many units remained tactically proficient and demonstrated combat effectiveness when necessary. Rather, they had calculated that combat no longer served any rational purpose. The war was irretrievably lost, Hitler's regime was collapsing, and the only remaining question was how to survive the transition from Wehrmacht soldier to prisoner of war. Hauptmann Ernst Vogel, a company commander in the 352nd Infantry Division, described the transformation in a post-war memoir published in 1958. He recounted how his company, which had fought with determination through the Normandy campaign and the Battle of the Bulge, simply ceased to function as a combat unit in late April 1945. Soldiers still followed basic orders regarding movement and camp security, but any directive involving combat with American forces met with passive resistance or outright refusal. Within the broader context of mass German surrender, individual episodes illustrated the complex human dimensions underlying the strategic calculus. One such episode, later known as Operation Cowboy, occurred at the Spanish Riding School's evacuation facility in Hostau, Czechoslovakia, where American forces and Wehrmacht officers collaborated to save priceless Lipizzaner horses from approaching Soviet forces. In late April 1945, Colonel Charles Reed of the 2nd Cavalry Group received an unusual request from Oberstleutnant Hubert Rudowski, commanding German forces guarding the Hostau stud farm. Rudowski proposed surrendering his entire unit to American forces on the condition that the horses be evacuated westward before Soviet arrival. The proposition represented a microcosm of the broader surrender dynamics, German officers willing to capitulate immediately if assured their charges would not fall into Soviet hands. Reed, an accomplished horseman who understood the historical significance of the Lipizzaner bloodline, authorized the operation despite its military irregularity. On April 28, 1945, American troops and German soldiers worked cooperatively to evacuate over 300 horses westward, toward American lines. The operation succeeded, with Rudovsky's unit surrendering peacefully, and the horses eventually returning to Vienna and the Spanish riding school. This episode, though involving horses rather than soldiers, perfectly encapsulated the pragmatic cooperation that characterized the final days of the European war in the West. German officers recognized that American forces distinguished between military necessity and cultural preservation in ways Soviet forces did not. The horses survived. Under Soviet occupation, they would likely have been requisitioned as meat or draft animals. The humanitarian calculations extended beyond symbolic gestures. As American forces advanced through Bavaria and Austria, they encountered concentration camp survivors, displaced persons, and civilian populations facing starvation. German military units, in the process of surrendering, often provided intelligence on the location of hidden food stores, ammunition dumps, and infrastructure that could be repurposed for civilian relief. This cooperation, motivated partly by the hope of favorable treatment as prisoners, nevertheless prevented considerable additional suffering. Major William Cowling, a civil affairs officer with the Third Army, documented dozens of instances where surrendering German officers provided detailed information about local conditions, facilitating American efforts to establish military governance. In several cases, German military police continued functioning under American supervision to maintain order during the chaotic transition period. This practical cooperation stood in stark contrast to the scorched earth destruction that characterized the Eastern Front, where retreating German forces demolished infrastructure to deny it to advancing Soviet forces. The treatment of German civilians by occupation forces further reinforced soldiers' preferences for American captivity. In territories occupied by American forces, military governance policies emphasized rapid restoration of basic services, prevention of retaliatory violence, and establishment of legal procedures for dealing with Nazi officials. These policies, while imperfectly implemented, created conditions far removed from the chaos that prevailed in Soviet-occupied territories. Frau Elisabeth Hoffmann, a resident of Nuremberg who survived the city's devastation, recorded her observations during the American occupation beginning in April 1945. Her diary, later published in a collection of civilian testimonies, described American soldiers distributing food to hungry civilians, military engineers restoring water supplies, and military police protecting civilians from violence. She specifically noted that retreating German soldiers had told civilians to remain in the city because American treatment would be tolerable, advice that proved largely accurate. The contrast became particularly evident regarding treatment of women. Soviet forces, operating in territories where German occupation had been particularly brutal, committed widespread sexual violence against German civilian populations. This pattern, extensively documented by historians including Anthony Beaver in his research on the fall of Berlin, created terror among German civilians and soldiers alike. American forces, while not immune to individual criminal behavior, maintained discipline and prosecuted sexual assault cases through military courts-martial. This fundamental difference in institutional policy significantly influenced German soldiers' surrender calculations. By late April 1945, entire German civilian populations were fleeing westward alongside military units, creating refugee columns that stretched for miles. American forces, though focused on military objectives, generally permitted these civilian evacuations and even provided limited assistance. The alternative, remaining in place to face Soviet occupation, seemed sufficiently terrible that millions of Germans risked the journey westward despite Allied aerial attacks, food shortages, and the breakdown of transportation infrastructure. The topography of Central Europe profoundly influenced the mechanics of mass German surrender. The Elbe River, flowing north through Germany, emerged as an unofficial demarcation line between Western Allied and Soviet operational zones. American forces advancing from the west and Soviet forces pressing from the east converged on this natural barrier in mid-April 1945, creating a geographic deadline for German units seeking to surrender westward. General Walton Walker's XX Corps reached the Elbe near Magdeburg on April 11, 1945, establishing bridgeheads on the eastern bank before halting to consolidate positions. This pause, ordered by Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower based on previous agreements with Soviet leadership, inadvertently created a desperate situation for German forces still east of the river. Wehrmacht units, recognizing that the American advance had stalled, launched frantic efforts to cross the Elbe before Soviet forces arrived. The bridges across the Elbe became bottlenecks of human desperation. German engineers, who had spent years demolishing bridges to slow Allied advances, now attempted to preserve or even repair bridges to facilitate westward movement. At Tangermünde, Wehrmacht sappers worked through the night of April 12 to 13, 1945, repairing a partially destroyed bridge to allow their division to cross. American artillery observers, watching through binoculars from the western bank, held fire as thousands of German soldiers and civilians streamed across, surrendering immediately upon reaching American lines. Lieutenant Colonel James Douglas, commanding a battalion of the 83rd Infantry Division along the Elbe, recorded the extraordinary scene in his after-action report. Over a 48-hour period from April 14th to 15th, 1945, his battalion processed the surrender of approximately 12,000 German soldiers who had crossed the river. The Germans arrived exhausted, hungry, and intensely relieved to have escaped Soviet encirclement. Many carried white flags improvised from bedsheets, handkerchiefs, or torn undershirts, the universal symbol of surrender that transcended language barriers. The psychological relief of reaching American lines manifested in dramatic ways. German soldiers, maintaining military bearing during their desperate flight, frequently collapsed upon surrendering, as if the psychological tension sustaining them suddenly released. American medics treated cases of exhaustion, malnutrition, and combat wounds, but also encountered soldiers suffering from what would later be recognized as acute stress reactions, the psychological toll of sustained terror, finally expressing itself in safe circumstances. The Bavarian Alps presented different geographic challenges and opportunities. The rugged mountain terrain, which Hitler's propagandists had mythologized as the location of an impregnable Alpine fortress, instead became a refuge for German units seeking to surrender under favorable terms. Mountain passes that could have been defended by small forces with devastating effectiveness remained undefended, as German commanders prioritized negotiating surrender rather than prolonging resistance. General Jacob Devers's 6th Army Group, advancing through southern Germany and Austria, encountered a paradoxical situation where German military resistance collapsed even as defensive terrain strengthened. On April 29, 1945, Devers reported to Eisenhower's headquarters that entire German divisions were requesting surrender negotiations, offering to abandon defensive positions in exchange for POW status. The traditional military calculation, trade ground for time, had inverted. German commanders now viewed time as their enemy, each passing day bringing Soviet forces closer and reducing their bargaining position with American forces. According to documentation in the National Archives compiled during the Nuremberg tribunals, several high-ranking German officers attempted to leverage their surrenders into political negotiations. They proposed surrendering their forces to American command, while remaining armed to assist in resisting any Soviet advance westward. These proposals, reflecting the immediate emergence of Cold War tensions that would soon dominate European politics, were uniformly rejected by American commanders operating under explicit orders to maintain alliance with Soviet forces until Nazi Germany's complete capitulation. The city of Prague presented the final dramatic geographic focal point for German surrender calculations. As the war's last days approached in early May 1945, German forces in Czechoslovakia faced encirclement by Soviet armies advancing from multiple directions. American forces under General George Patton's Third Army had reached western Czechoslovakia, but were ordered to halt their advance on Prague, leaving the Czech capital within the designated Soviet liberation zone. This geographic constraint created a desperate situation for German Army Group Center, commanded by General Feldmarschall Ferdinand Schörner. His forces, numbering over 600,000 soldiers, occupied positions that would fall within Soviet operational areas. Schörner, a fanatical Nazi who had earned Hitler's loyalty through brutal discipline and ideological commitment, attempted to maintain resistance even as his subordinate commanders negotiated independent surrenders. May 1, 1945, brought news that shattered the remaining psychological foundations of German resistance. Adolf Hitler's death in the Berlin Führer bunker. The announcement, made by Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz in his capacity as Hitler's designated successor, eliminated the personal oath of loyalty that had bound German military officers to continued resistance. While many officers had privately concluded the war was lost, Hitler's survival had represented a legal and psychological barrier to surrender. His death removed that barrier. Dönitz, assuming leadership of what remained of the German government, faced an impossible situation. Headquartered in Flensburg near the Danish border, he commanded forces that existed more in theory than reality. German units in the west were surrendering en masse. Soviet forces had captured Berlin, and the remaining territorial holdings consisted of disconnected pockets with no strategic coherence. Dönitz's primary objective became securing the best possible surrender terms while enabling maximum westward evacuation of German military and civilian personnel. On May 2, 1945, German forces in Italy surrendered unconditionally to Allied forces, a capitulation negotiated by SS Obergruppenführer Karl Wolff through Swiss intermediaries. This surrender, involving nearly 1 million German and Italian fascist troops, established a precedent for regional capitulations that Dönitz hoped to replicate elsewhere. His strategy focused on surrendering to Western allies while attempting to maintain resistance against Soviet forces, thereby enabling continued westward evacuation. General Alfred Jodl, chief of operations for the Wehrmacht High Command, became Dönitz's primary instrument for surrender negotiations. On May 4, 1945, Jodl traveled to British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's headquarters on Lüneburg Heath to negotiate surrender of German forces in northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. Montgomery, displaying the autocratic personality that had characterized his military career, initially demanded immediate unconditional surrender. However, practical considerations regarding the enormous prisoner population and the need to prevent continued casualties led to acceptance of a partial regional surrender. The Lüneburg Heath surrender, signed on May 4 and effective May 5, 1945, represented the beginning of the end. German forces in the designated areas ceased resistance and began the formal process of capitulation. Critically, the agreement permitted continued German military administration temporarily, enabling organized surrender rather than chaotic collapse. This concession reflected Allied recognition that processing nearly 2 million surrendering soldiers required cooperation from existing German command structures. Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg, Dönitz's designated surrender negotiator, then traveled to General Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims, France, carrying instructions to negotiate separate surrender to Western allies while maintaining resistance against Soviet forces. Eisenhower, aware of the political implications and operating under directives to maintain Allied unity, flatly refused any conditional or partial surrender. His ultimatum was stark: unconditional surrender on all fronts simultaneously, or continued warfare with no quarter given. Von Friedeberg, desperate to delay and enable additional westward evacuations, attempted to negotiate extensions and exceptions. Eisenhower responded by threatening to seal the Western Front entirely, preventing any further German soldier or civilian from reaching American lines. This threat, combined with the obvious futility of continued resistance, forced German acceptance of unconditional surrender terms. On May 7, 1945, at 0241 hours, General Jodl signed the instrument of unconditional surrender at Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims. The document specified that all German armed forces would cease active operations by May 8 at 2301 hours, the final moment of the Third Reich's legal existence. A parallel ceremony in Berlin, demanded by Stalin to emphasize Soviet role in Germany's defeat, occurred on May 8 with General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel signing surrender documents in the presence of Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov. The period between surrender signing and its formal effective time created a final window for German military personnel to reach Western lines. Wehrmacht units that had maintained cohesion specifically for this purpose now executed final forced marches westward. The desperation of these final hours manifested in extraordinary scenes along the Elbe and other demarcation lines, where German soldiers literally raced against time to cross into American or British custody before the surrender deadline. Corporal Hans Schmidt, a Wehrmacht infantryman with the 212th Infantry Division, recorded his unit's final march in a diary later donated to the German Historical Museum. His division, positioned in Saxony when the surrender was announced, marched continuously for 27 hours to reach American lines near Leipzig. Schmidt described soldiers discarding equipment, weapons, and personal possessions to move faster, motivated entirely by the knowledge that every kilometer westward improved their chances of survival. The immediate aftermath of German surrender confronted American military authorities with a humanitarian and logistical crisis of unprecedented scale. Within days of May 8, 1945, over 3 million German soldiers had surrendered to Western Allied forces, with numbers continuing to increase as stragglers and holdouts capitulated. The existing prisoner of war infrastructure, designed for far smaller populations, collapsed under this onslaught. General Eisenhower's headquarters issued urgent directives establishing temporary detention facilities across occupied Germany. These camps, designated as prisoner of war temporary enclosures, consisted of open fields surrounded by wire fencing and guard posts. The largest concentrations emerged in the Rhine Valley, where flat terrain facilitated mass detention, even as it provided minimal shelter or sanitation infrastructure. Captain Harold Wilson, a logistics officer with the Quartermaster Corps, struggled to provide basic necessities for prisoner populations that overwhelmed every planning estimate. His unit, responsible for a detention facility near Remagen holding approximately 60,000 German prisoners, faced impossible mathematics. Food supplies calculated for supporting combat operations proved inadequate for prisoner populations. Water distribution systems designed for military encampments failed when applied to civilian-scale populations, lacking proper sanitation infrastructure. The prisoners themselves, having achieved their primary objective of avoiding Soviet captivity, now confronted the harsh reality of mass detention in improvised circumstances. German soldiers lived in open fields, sleeping on bare ground regardless of weather, with minimal shelter beyond blankets and improvised tents constructed from whatever materials could be scavenged. Latrine facilities consisted of open trenches that quickly became sources of disease. Food rations, when available, provided barely adequate calories and minimal nutritional variety. These conditions, while harsh, still represented survival, the fundamental distinction that had motivated westward surrender. German prisoners maintained informal organization through existing military hierarchies, with Wehrmacht officers and NCOs managing internal camp affairs under American supervision. This self-administration proved essential for maintaining order among enormous prisoner populations guarded by relatively small numbers of American troops. According to post-war investigations conducted by the United States Army Inspector General, mortality in the temporary detention camps remained controversial. Official records documented relatively low death rates attributed to the harsh conditions, though these figures were later disputed by German advocacy groups and researchers. What remains undisputed is that virtually all prisoners in American custody survived to eventual release, a stark contrast to the fate of German prisoners in Soviet captivity. The processing of individual prisoners required bureaucratic procedures that overwhelmed available administrative capacity. Each prisoner needed documentation, medical screening, interrogation to determine military history and possible war crimes involvement, and classification for eventual disposition. American military government detachments established processing centers where German soldiers queued for hours to complete paperwork that would determine their immediate future. Lieutenant Margaret Hastings, a military intelligence officer assigned to prisoner interrogation, described the systematic screening process in her post-war memoir published in 1982. Her team evaluated German prisoners to identify SS personnel, Gestapo operatives, and individuals potentially involved in war crimes. The screening relied on document examination, physical inspection for SS blood group tattoos, and witness testimony from other prisoners. Those identified as potential war criminals were segregated for further investigation and possible prosecution. The vast majority of Wehrmacht prisoners, having no involvement in war crimes beyond ordinary combat, faced extended detention, while Allied authorities determined repatriation policies. The Potsdam Conference in July-August 1945 established frameworks for German prisoner repatriation, though actual releases proceeded slowly. German prisoners became a labor resource for Allied reconstruction efforts, working under guard to clear rubble, repair infrastructure, and assist with essential services in occupied Germany. For many German soldiers, imprisonment by American or British forces extended months or even years beyond the war's conclusion. However, this extended detention occurred within legal frameworks that provided basic protections, permitted Red Cross monitoring, and eventually concluded with repatriation to Germany. Soviet-held prisoners, by contrast, faced dramatically different circumstances, with the last German POWs not returning from Soviet captivity until 1956, over a decade after the war's end. The psychological impact of imprisonment varied considerably among German prisoners. Many expressed relief at having survived, gratitude for basic humane treatment, and hope for eventual return to their families. Others struggled with the trauma of defeat, the destruction of their homeland, and uncertainty about their family's fate in the chaos of post-war Germany. American chaplains and medical personnel noted high rates of depression, anxiety, and other psychological conditions among prisoner populations. The mass westward surrender of German forces in 1945 represented more than a military phenomenon. It reflected fundamental truths about human nature, institutional behavior, and the laws of war that continue to resonate through subsequent conflicts. The nearly 500,000 German soldiers who chose American captivity over Soviet capture made a decision rooted in rational calculation about survival, shaped by the reputations their captors had earned through years of warfare. The divergence in treatment between Western Allied and Soviet prisoner policies stemmed from multiple factors. American and British forces operated under institutional constraints, including adherence to Geneva Convention protocols, oversight by military legal systems, and monitoring by international organizations like the Red Cross. These constraints, while sometimes honored more in breach than observance, established accountability mechanisms that fundamentally shaped prisoner treatment. Soviet forces, by contrast, operated within a system that prioritized collective punishment, ideological retribution, and economic exploitation of prisoner labor. Professor Gerhard Weinberg, in his comprehensive study, A World at Arms, published in 1994, analyzed the strategic implications of German surrender patterns. He noted that the Wehrmacht's collapse in the West occurred more rapidly than Allied planners anticipated, precisely because German resistance focused on enabling eastward retreat rather than defending territory. This dynamic shortened the European war's conclusion, while concentrating final destruction in Eastern European territories where German forces attempted to maintain positions against Soviet advances. The approximately 3 million German prisoners held by Western Allied forces required years to repatriate. The process of screening, classification, and eventual release extended into the early 1950s, with the most complicated cases involving individuals suspected of war crimes or those whose home regions fell within Soviet occupation zones. Many German prisoners chose to remain in Western Germany rather than return to Soviet-controlled territories, effectively becoming refugees even after release from POW status. The contrast between Western and Soviet treatment of German prisoners influenced Cold War narratives on both sides. Western democracies cited their adherence to international law and humane treatment of prisoners as evidence of moral superiority over Soviet totalitarianism. Soviet authorities, conversely, emphasized the massive casualties inflicted by German aggression to justify harsh treatment of German prisoners, framing it as legitimate punishment rather than violation of international law. For individual German soldiers who survived the war, their surrender decisions carried lifetime consequences. Those captured by Soviet forces who eventually returned to Germany often found their experiences dismissed or minimized in Cold War West Germany, where political considerations discouraged highlighting Soviet atrocities. Those who surrendered to Western forces generally reintegrated more easily into post-war German society, though they carried the psychological burden of defeat, occupation, and the knowledge of what their military service had supported. The children and grandchildren of German soldiers who surrendered in 1945 inherited complex legacies. Family narratives often emphasized the practical wisdom of surrendering to Americans rather than Soviets, framing the decision as savvy survival strategy rather than military defeat. These family stories frequently omitted or minimized the broader context of German aggression, occupation brutality, and systematic atrocities that created the conditions for harsh Soviet treatment. Historical research continues to refine understanding of these events. Archives opened after the Cold War's end provided access to Soviet documentation detailing prisoner treatment, German military records revealing surrender negotiations, and personal testimonies from participants on all sides. This expanded documentary base has enabled more nuanced analysis that moves beyond simplistic narratives of victimization or retribution to examine the complex interplay of military necessity, ideological commitment, institutional culture, and individual agency. The United States Army's official history, compiled by the Center of Military History and published across multiple volumes in the decades following the war, documented that American forces captured approximately 3.8 million German prisoners between D-Day and June 1944, and Germany's surrender in May 1945. The overwhelming majority of these captures occurred in the final 6 weeks of the war, as Wehrmacht units executed their strategic shift from resistance to organized capitulation. This concentration of surrenders strained every aspect of American military logistics and prisoner administration. Dr. Rüdiger Overmans, a German military historian who conducted exhaustive research on German prisoner statistics published in 1999, established that approximately 11 million German soldiers became prisoners of war to all Allied powers by the war's conclusion. Of these, roughly 7.5 million fell into Western Allied custody, while 3.5 million were captured by Soviet forces. The stark difference in survival rates between these populations, with Western-held prisoners experiencing mortality rates below 5% compared to Soviet-held prisoners experiencing mortality rates exceeding 30%, validated the desperate calculations that drove westward surrender. The phenomenon of mass surrender to avoid worse captivity has recurred in subsequent conflicts, though rarely at the scale witnessed in 1945. During the Korean War, Chinese and North Korean soldiers occasionally sought capture by American forces, rather than face their own command authorities. In the Gulf War of 1991, Iraqi soldiers surrendered en masse to coalition forces, motivated partly by the hope of treatment superior to conditions under Saddam Hussein's regime. These instances reflected the same fundamental calculation. Surrender to adversaries perceived as more humane represented a rational survival strategy. The legal and ethical frameworks governing prisoner treatment evolved significantly in the post-war period, influenced directly by the experiences of World War II. The Geneva Conventions were substantially revised in 1949 to strengthen protections for prisoners of war, civilians in occupied territories, and non-combatants. These revisions attempted to prevent the worst abuses witnessed during the war, while recognizing that enforcement depended ultimately on institutional commitment and international monitoring. For the families of German soldiers who never returned from Soviet captivity, the contrast with those who surrendered to Western forces created lasting bitterness. The German Red Cross established extensive tracing services attempting to locate missing soldiers, a process complicated by Soviet refusal to provide complete prisoner lists or allow unrestricted access to camps. Families often waited years for confirmation of whether their loved ones had survived, with many never receiving definitive answers about soldiers who disappeared into the Soviet camp system. Margaret Buber-Neumann, a German communist who survived both Soviet Gulag and Nazi concentration camp imprisonment, wrote extensively about the comparative experiences in her memoir, Under Two Dictators, published in 1949. Her unique perspective, having experienced both totalitarian prison systems as well as liberation by American forces, provided powerful testimony about the fundamental differences in institutional culture and treatment of prisoners. Her work, though controversial in Cold War Germany, offered crucial insights into why German soldiers so desperately sought to avoid Soviet captivity. The physical landscape of post-war Germany bore witness to these surrender patterns. The Rhine Valley, where temporary American detention camps had held hundreds of thousands of German prisoners, became a region of collective memory marked by monuments, memorials, and historical sites. Communities near former camp locations developed complex relationships with this history, acknowledging the suffering of German prisoners while recognizing the broader context of Nazi aggression and atrocities that created the conditions for Germany's defeat. In contemporary Germany, the history of mass westward surrender occupies an ambiguous position within national memory. It represents neither heroic resistance nor shameful collaboration, but rather a pragmatic response to impossible circumstances. Educational curricula address the topic within the broader context of World War II's conclusion, emphasizing the consequences of aggressive warfare, while acknowledging the human dimension of ordinary soldiers seeking survival amid catastrophic defeat. The strategic decision-making of German commanders who negotiated surrenders has been subject to historical reassessment. Figures like General Feldmarschall Kesselring, who balanced Hitler's demands for continued resistance against the practical reality of military collapse, occupied a morally complex position. They served a criminal regime and bore responsibility for extending a lost war, yet their eventual acceptance of surrender reality prevented additional casualties and suffering. Historical judgment remains divided on whether their actions in the war's final weeks represented pragmatic humanity or merely belated recognition of inevitable defeat. The approximately 480,000 German soldiers, who specifically surrendered to American forces rather than face Soviet captivity, the figure highlighted in contemporary historical accounts, represented a subset of the broader westward surrender phenomenon. This number, derived from American military records documenting surrenders in Bavaria, Austria, and Czechoslovakia during late April and early May 1945, captured instances where German units explicitly chose American over Soviet captivity when both options existed. The psychological calculus behind these surrenders, fear of Soviet revenge, hope for American adherence to international law, and desperate desire for survival, reflected broader patterns that shaped the European war's conclusion. The story of these surrenders ultimately transcends military history to illuminate fundamental questions about human behavior under extreme circumstances. When institutional protections erode and survival depends on choosing between adversaries, individuals make rational calculations based on available information about likely treatment. The German soldiers who surrendered westward in 1945 demonstrated that even within the context of a criminal war of aggression, individual survival instinct operates according to logic that transcends ideology and nationality. Their legacy serves as testimony to the importance of institutional commitment to international law, humane treatment of prisoners, and accountability mechanisms that constrain the worst impulses of warfare. The contrast between American and Soviet treatment of German prisoners, while both imperfect, illustrated how institutional culture and legal frameworks shape outcomes even in warfare's chaotic conditions. This lesson remains relevant for contemporary conflicts, where treatment of prisoners continues to test the boundaries between military necessity and humanitarian obligation. The final accounting of German surrender in World War II confirms that nearly 500,000 soldiers made a choice that saved their lives, a choice made possible by the belief, largely validated by subsequent experience, that surrendering to American forces offered survival, where other options promised only death or indefinite captivity. Their decision, replicated by millions of others across the collapsing Third Reich, brought the European war to its conclusion and shaped the post-war order that would define the remainder of the 20th century.